Have you ever wondered what it would be like if time itself came to a halt? Imagine looking up at the sky and watching the sun freeze in place, refusing to set, as if the very laws of physics had been suspended by an invisible hand. This isn't science fiction or fantasy. This is exactly what the Bible claims happened over 3,000 years ago during one of the most extraordinary battles in human history. In the book of Joshua, we encounter an event so miraculous, so impossible by natural standards, that it has puzzled scholars, scientists, and believers for centuries. On a single day, during a desperate military campaign, a man named Joshua did something that no human being had ever done before or since. He commanded the sun to stand still, and according to Scripture, it obeyed. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. The Bible doesn't present this as myth or metaphor. It records it as historical fact, complete with specific geographical locations, detailed battle accounts, and even references to ancient documents that supposedly contained additional information about this miraculous day. The text itself acknowledges how unprecedented this event was, declaring that there had never been a day like it before or since, when the Lord listened to the voice of a man. Yet this raises profound questions that have echoed through millennia. Did the sun actually stop moving in the sky? Could the Earth's rotation have ceased without destroying all life on the planet? Was this an ancient eclipse misunderstood by primitive observers? Or is there something far more extraordinary happening here that challenges everything we think we know about the intersection of faith, science, and history? What you're about to discover will take you deep into one of the most debated miracles in Scripture. We'll explore cutting-edge archaeological evidence, examine NASA's involvement in this ancient mystery, and uncover scientific theories that attempt to explain the impossible. From the blood-soaked battlefields of ancient Canaan to modern computer simulations, from Hebrew linguistics to astronomical calculations, this journey will challenge your understanding of what's possible when heaven invades Earth. But this isn't just about ancient history. This is about the kind of God who responds to impossible prayers and the kind of faith that dares to ask for miracles. It's about a moment when time itself bowed to the will of the Almighty and what that means for us today. If you've ever struggled with doubt about biblical miracles, if you've wondered whether science and faith can coexist, or if you've hesitated to pray for the impossible because it seemed too bold, then stay with me. Because what happened on Joshua's long day might just transform how you see God's power in your own life. Comment 777 if you're ready to discover the truth behind the day the sun stood still. And make sure to subscribe, because we're about to embark on a journey that will take you from the ancient world to the cutting edge of modern science. Let's begin by stepping back in time to understand the desperate situation that led to this unprecedented miracle. The year was approximately 1400 BC, though some scholars place it closer to 1207 BC. The Israelites, under the leadership of Joshua, were in the midst of conquering the Promised Land. This wasn't a peaceful settlement or gradual migration. This was warfare, brutal and decisive, as God's chosen people fought to claim the inheritance He had promised to their ancestor Abraham centuries earlier. The military campaign had been nothing short of miraculous from the beginning. The walls of Jericho had collapsed at the sound of trumpets and shouting. The city of Ai had fallen through divine strategy after an initial defeat taught the Israelites about the consequences of hidden sin. City after city was falling before the advancing Israelite army, and word of their victories was spreading terror throughout the land of Canaan. But then something unexpected happened that would set the stage for the greatest miracle of the conquest. The Gibeonites, inhabitants of a powerful city-state, realized they couldn't defeat Israel in battle, so they resorted to deception. They disguised themselves as travelers from a distant land, complete with worn-out clothes, moldy bread, and cracked wineskins. They approached Joshua and the Israelite leaders, claiming to have traveled from far away because they had heard of Israel's mighty God. The deception worked perfectly. The Bible records that Joshua and the leaders made a critical error. They examined the evidence, they listened to the story, but they failed to do the one thing that could have revealed the truth. They didn't consult the Lord. Instead, they entered into a peace treaty with the Gibeonites, binding themselves by oath to protect them. Within 3 days, the truth came out. The Gibeonites weren't from a distant land. They were neighbors, living right in the heart of the territory Israel was supposed to conquer. According to God's explicit commands, these people should have been destroyed, along with all the other Canaanite inhabitants. Instead, Israel was now bound by a sacred oath to protect them. This created a massive problem, not just for Israel, but for the entire political landscape of Canaan. The other Canaanite kings viewed the Gibeonite alliance with Israel as an act of treason. If Gibeon, one of the great cities of the region, could make peace with the invaders, it might inspire others to do the same. The balance of power was shifting, and the remaining Canaanite kings knew they had to act quickly. The response was swift and decisive. 5 of the most powerful kings in the region formed a coalition. Leading them was Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, whose very name meant Lord of Righteousness. Joining him were the kings of Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. These weren't minor chieftains or tribal leaders. These were the rulers of fortified city-states, each controlling significant territory and commanding professional armies. Their strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of attacking Israel directly, they would punish the traitors first. They would besiege Gibeon, making an example of what happened to those who allied with the invaders. If they could crush Gibeon quickly, it would send a message to every other city in Canaan. Submit to us or face the same fate. The Gibeonites found themselves in a desperate situation. Their deception had saved them from destruction by Israel, but now it had made them targets for their former allies. They had burned their bridges with the Canaanite coalition and were facing annihilation. They had only one hope, and it required swallowing their pride and appealing to the very people they had deceived. The message they sent to Joshua was urgent and direct. Do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us. For all the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the hill country have gathered against us. They were calling in the debt. Israel had made a covenant to protect them, and now they were demanding that Israel honor that commitment. Joshua faced an impossible decision. From a human perspective, this was a trap. The Gibeonites had lied to him, manipulated him into a treaty he never should have made. Now they were asking him to risk his entire army to save them from a coalition of 5 kings. It would mean marching his forces into the heart of enemy territory, fighting on ground of the enemy's choosing, against overwhelming odds. But Joshua understood something that goes beyond military strategy or political calculation. He understood covenant. Even though the treaty with Gibeon had been made through deception, it was still a binding oath before God. Israel's reputation, and more importantly, God's reputation, was at stake. If Israel abandoned the Gibeonites now, word would spread that Israel's promises meant nothing. Their future negotiations and treaties would be worthless. More than that, Joshua recognized this as a divine opportunity. The 5 kings had done exactly what Israel needed them to do. Instead of forcing Israel to lay siege to 5 separate fortified cities, they had brought their armies out into the open. If God granted victory, Joshua could potentially destroy 5 armies in a single battle, eliminating the major military threat in southern Canaan in one decisive stroke. So Joshua made his choice. He would honor the covenant with Gibeon, even though it had been obtained through deception. He would march his army through the night, covering nearly 20 miles of difficult terrain, ascending over 3,000 feet in elevation. It was a grueling march that would test the endurance of even his best soldiers. But as Joshua prepared for what could be the most important battle of the conquest, he had no idea that he was about to witness something that would defy every natural law he understood. He was about to participate in a miracle so extraordinary that it would be remembered and debated for over 3,000 years. He was about to discover what happens when human desperation meets divine power, when impossible circumstances collide with unlimited faith. The stage was set for the longest day in human history. 5 kings with their combined armies were besieging Gibeon. Joshua and his forces were racing through the night to reach the battle. And somewhere in the heavens, the God who created the sun, moon, and stars was preparing to demonstrate his absolute sovereignty over the natural order he had established. What happened next would forever change how we understand the relationship between heaven and earth, between human need and divine response, between the natural and the supernatural. It was a day when time itself would bow to the will of the Almighty, when the very rotation of the earth would yield to the desperate prayer of a man who dared to ask God for the impossible. But before we dive into the miracle itself, we need to understand the military genius behind Joshua's strategy and the supernatural elements that were already at work even before the sun stood still. Because what happened at the Battle of Gibeon wasn't just about astronomical phenomena. It was about the God of Israel demonstrating his power to fight for his people in ways that would leave no doubt about who truly controlled the outcome of this crucial battle. The march from Gilgal to Gibeon was itself a remarkable feat of military endurance and tactical planning. Joshua's army had to cover approximately 20 miles in darkness, climbing over 3,000 feet in elevation. This wasn't a casual journey or a daylight march with regular rest stops. This was a forced march through the night, designed to achieve complete tactical surprise. The physical demands were extraordinary. Modern military experts estimate that such a march would require 8 to 10 hours of continuous movement over difficult terrain. The soldiers would have been carrying full battle gear, weapons, and supplies. Many would have been fighting fatigue, dehydration, and the disorientation that comes with night movement through unfamiliar territory. But Joshua's strategy went beyond simply arriving at the battlefield. He positioned his forces to achieve maximum tactical advantage. Instead of approaching Gibeon directly, he maneuvered his army to attack the besieging coalition from an unexpected direction. The Amorite kings had positioned their forces around Gibeon, focused on breaching the city's defenses. They weren't expecting an attack from behind, especially not at dawn after what they assumed was a night of rest and preparation. The element of surprise was complete. As the sun began to rise, Joshua's forces struck like a thunderbolt. The Bible records that the Lord threw them into a panic before Israel. This wasn't just military confusion or the chaos of unexpected battle. The Hebrew word suggests supernatural terror, a divine intervention that shattered the enemy's ability to mount an organized defense. What followed was a rout of unprecedented proportions. The 5 kings and their armies didn't just retreat in good order. They fled in complete panic, abandoning their siege of Gibeon and running for their lives. But Joshua knew that this was more than just a tactical victory. This was his opportunity to eliminate the major military threat in southern Canaan once and for all. The pursuit began immediately. The fleeing armies headed toward Beth Horon, following the natural escape route down the steep descent toward the coastal plain. Joshua's forces followed relentlessly, cutting down stragglers and preventing the enemy from regrouping. But as the chase continued, Joshua faced a tactical nightmare that every military commander fears. Time was running out. As the pursuit stretched on through the morning hours, Joshua found himself caught in a commander's worst nightmare. His forces had achieved the impossible. They had surprised and routed 5 armies simultaneously, scattering the most powerful military coalition in southern Canaan. But now, as the enemy fled down the treacherous slopes toward Beth Horon, precious daylight was slipping away like sand through his fingers. You have to understand the tactical situation Joshua was facing. This wasn't just about winning a single battle. This was about seizing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reshape the entire military landscape of the Promised Land. These 5 kings represented the backbone of Canaanite resistance in the south. Their armies, if allowed to escape and regroup, would live to fight another day. They would retreat to their fortified cities, rebuild their forces, and continue to threaten Israel's conquest for years to come. But if Joshua could pursue them to complete destruction, if he could eliminate these armies entirely, the entire southern campaign would be won in a single day. Cities that would normally require months of siege warfare would be left defenseless. The psychological impact alone would be devastating. Word would spread throughout Canaan that no coalition, no matter how powerful, could stand against Israel and their God. The problem was time. Ancient warfare was governed by daylight. Once darkness fell, organized pursuit became virtually impossible. Soldiers couldn't distinguish friend from enemy. Formations would break apart. The advantage would shift to the defenders, who knew the local terrain intimately. Joshua needed more time, but time was the one thing no military commander could control. Or so he thought. As his forces pressed the pursuit down the Beth Horon Ridge, something extraordinary began to happen. The retreating Amorite armies suddenly found themselves under attack from an entirely different direction. The sky itself became their enemy. Massive hailstones began to fall from heaven with devastating precision and supernatural timing. This wasn't ordinary weather. The Bible records that these hailstones killed more of the enemy than Israel's swords. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about stones falling from the sky with such force and accuracy that they became more effective than trained warriors with weapons. Modern meteorologists have documented hailstones weighing 4 to 5 pounds in severe storms. In 1888, a hailstorm in northern India killed 246 people and 1,600 animals. But those were random weather events. This was targeted divine intervention. The precision was remarkable. The hailstone struck the fleeing Amorites but apparently missed the pursuing Israelites. The timing was perfect, intensifying just as the enemy forces were most vulnerable on the exposed slopes. And the duration was exactly what Joshua needed to press his advantage. This wasn't a brief cloudburst that would delay both armies equally. This was sustained supernatural support that tilted the entire battle in Israel's favor. But even with divine hailstones hammering his enemies, Joshua could see that daylight was still his greatest constraint. The pursuit was succeeding beyond his wildest dreams, but the sun was moving inexorably toward the western horizon. Soon the shadows would lengthen, visibility would decrease, and the advantage would shift. He needed more time to complete the destruction of these armies and secure the victory. That would change the course of the entire conquest. And that's when Joshua did something that reveals the extraordinary depth of his relationship with God. In the heat of battle, with his army scattered in pursuit across miles of terrain, with the fate of the conquest hanging in the balance, Joshua looked up at the sky and spoke directly to the Creator of the universe. Not in private prayer, not in the quiet of his tent, but in full view of both his own forces and the enemy armies. He made a request that was so audacious, so impossible, that it took breathtaking faith even to voice it. Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon, in the valley of Aijalon. Can you imagine the stunned silence that must have followed those words? Here was a human being, standing on a battlefield, commanding celestial bodies to halt their movement through the heavens. By any natural understanding, it was the height of absurdity. The sun and moon had followed their appointed courses since the moment of creation. They had never deviated from their paths for any human request. What possible reason was there to think they would obey the command of a mortal man, even one chosen by God? But Joshua wasn't speaking to the sun and moon as natural phenomena. He was speaking to the God who created them, the God who had already demonstrated his willingness to suspend natural laws on behalf of his people. This was the same God who had parted the Red Sea, who had caused water to flow from rocks, who had made the walls of Jericho collapse at the sound of trumpets. Joshua had witnessed miracle after miracle. He had learned to expect the impossible when God's purposes were at stake. What happened next defies every natural law we understand about physics, astronomy, and planetary motion. The Bible records it with stark simplicity. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped till the people had revenge upon their enemies. But that simple statement represents one of the most mind-bending events in human history. Think about what this means from a scientific perspective. If the sun actually stopped moving across the sky, if the Earth's rotation slowed or ceased, the consequences should have been catastrophic. The momentum of everything on the planet's surface should have sent objects flying eastward at tremendous speeds. Oceans should have sloshed across continents. The atmosphere should have continued rotating while the surface stopped, creating winds of unimaginable fury. Tidal forces should have torn the planet apart. Yet none of this happened. The Bible presents this as a controlled, precise miracle with no destructive side effects. Somehow, the natural order was suspended without causing chaos. The laws of physics were overruled without destroying the Earth. It was as if the Creator reached into His creation and adjusted the cosmic machinery with the same ease that a watchmaker might stop the hands of a clock. But here's where the story becomes even more remarkable. The text doesn't just say the sun stopped. It says it stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. We're not talking about a brief pause or a momentary hesitation. This was an extended suspension of natural order that lasted approximately 12 additional hours. An entire extra day was added to the normal 24-hour cycle. The military implications were staggering. What had begun as a dawn surprise attack now stretched into the afternoon and beyond. Joshua's forces had unlimited time to pursue their enemies, to cut off escape routes, to hunt down scattered remnants of the 5 armies. The tactical advantage that should have lasted only a few hours was extended indefinitely. The enemy forces, already demoralized by their defeat and the supernatural hailstorm, now faced the psychological terror of fighting under an unnatural sky where the sun refused to set. For the Israelite soldiers, this miracle must have been both inspiring and unnerving. On one hand, it was unmistakable evidence that their God was fighting for them. No enemy could stand against a deity who controlled the heavens themselves. Their victory was assured, their cause vindicated. But on the other hand, they were witnessing something that challenged every assumption they had about how the world worked. They were living through a day that had no precedent in human experience. The Bible emphasizes just how unprecedented this event was, and there was no day like that before it or after it, that the Lord heeded the voice of a man. For the Lord fought for Israel. This wasn't just unusual weather or an impressive military victory. This was a unique moment in history when the natural order itself was suspended in response to human prayer. It was a demonstration of divine power so extraordinary that it would never be repeated. But why this battle? Why this moment? Why did God choose to perform such a spectacular miracle for what was essentially a rescue mission to save the deceptive Gibeonites? The answer reveals something profound about God's character and His relationship with His people. This wasn't just about military tactics or territorial conquest. This was about covenant faithfulness, about honoring commitments even when they had been obtained through deception. Joshua had made a promise to protect Gibeon. Even though that promise had been extracted through lies, it was still a binding oath before God. By honoring that commitment, even at great risk and cost, Joshua was demonstrating the kind of character that God could use for extraordinary purposes. He was showing that His word could be trusted, that His integrity was unshakable, that He would keep His commitments regardless of the circumstances. God responded to that integrity with unprecedented power. The miracle wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about validating the character of a leader who chose covenant faithfulness over personal convenience. It was about demonstrating that when human integrity aligns with divine purpose, even the impossible becomes possible. The psychological impact of this miracle extended far beyond the battlefield. Word of what had happened would spread throughout the ancient world. Every king, every army, every city would hear about the day the sun stood still at Joshua's command. The reputation of Israel and Israel's God would be established in a way that no ordinary military victory could achieve. Future enemies would hesitate before challenging a people whose deity could stop the sun in the sky. But there's another dimension to this miracle that we need to explore. The text makes a fascinating reference that has puzzled scholars for centuries. It mentions that this event is written in the book of Jasher. This mysterious book, referenced elsewhere in the Old Testament, but long since lost to history, apparently contained additional details about Joshua's long day. What might those details have revealed? What other perspective might this ancient source have provided on the most extraordinary day in human history? The Book of Jasher represents one of the most tantalizing mysteries in biblical literature. Here was an ancient document, mentioned twice in the Old Testament, that apparently contained additional details about some of the most significant events in Israel's history. Yet this book has vanished from history, leaving us with only brief references to hint at what treasures it might have contained. What makes the reference to Jasher particularly intriguing in this context is that the biblical author felt compelled to cite it as corroborating evidence for Joshua's miracle. This wasn't presented as folklore or religious mythology. The writer was essentially saying, if you doubt this account, go check the historical records. Look it up in the Book of Jasher. The documentation exists. This suggests that Joshua's long day wasn't just witnessed by the Israelite army, or even just by the participants in the battle. The event was apparently so significant, so widely observed, that it made its way into the official historical records of the time. The Book of Jasher was likely a collection of heroic songs and historical accounts, celebrating the great deeds of Israel's leaders. For this miracle to be included, there means it was considered historically verifiable by ancient standards. But here's where the story takes a fascinating modern twist that has captured the imagination of believers and skeptics alike. For decades, a story has circulated claiming that NASA scientists, while programming their computers to calculate satellite positions and orbital mechanics, discovered a missing day in their calculations. According to this account, the computers detected a gap in astronomical time that corresponded exactly to the biblical account of Joshua's long day and King Hezekiah's sundial miracle. The story goes that Harold Hill, a NASA consultant, was working with the space program when the computers flagged an anomaly in their calculations. The scientists allegedly found that they were missing approximately 24 hours somewhere in ancient history. When Hill supposedly remembered the biblical accounts, they calculated that 23 hours and 20 minutes were missing from Joshua's time, and the remaining 40 minutes corresponded to the sundial incident during Hezekiah's reign. It's a compelling story that has been shared countless times in Christian circles, often presented as scientific proof of biblical miracles. There's just one problem: it's completely false. NASA has repeatedly denied any involvement in such calculations, and the story has been thoroughly debunked by both scientists and biblical scholars. Harold Hill did work briefly at NASA, but as a plant engineer with no access to orbital computers or astronomical calculations. The fundamental flaw in the NASA story is mathematical. To detect a missing day in ancient history, scientists would need precise reference points from that time period. They would need accurate astronomical observations and reliable timekeeping records going back thousands of years. But such records simply don't exist. Ancient civilizations didn't maintain the kind of precise chronological data that would be necessary to detect discrepancies in elapsed time. Moreover, our modern understanding of celestial mechanics is based on observing current planetary positions and extrapolating backward using mathematical models. If a day had actually been added to history, our calculations would automatically account for it. There would be no discrepancy to detect because our mathematical models would incorporate whatever actually happened. The persistence of the NASA story reveals something important about how desperately some people want scientific validation for their faith. But here's the irony. The search for scientific proof of Joshua's miracle actually undermines the very nature of what makes it miraculous in the first place. If we could prove it scientifically, if we could explain it through natural causes, it wouldn't be a miracle at all. It would just be an unusual natural phenomenon that ancient people didn't understand. This brings us to one of the most important questions surrounding Joshua's long day. How do we interpret what actually happened? The biblical text is clear that something extraordinary occurred, but it leaves room for different understandings of the mechanism behind the miracle. One possibility is that the sun literally stopped moving across the sky, which would require the Earth's rotation to slow down or cease entirely. This interpretation takes the text at face value and assumes that God supernaturally prevented the catastrophic effects that would normally result from such a change. It emphasizes God's absolute sovereignty over natural law and his ability to suspend physics when necessary for his purposes. But there's another interpretation that has gained significant attention from scholars and scientists. What if the miracle involved a solar eclipse rather than the Earth's rotation stopping? Recent research by Cambridge astronomers suggests that Joshua's long day might have been an annular eclipse that occurred on October 30th, 1207 BC. This interpretation hinges on the Hebrew word dam, which is typically translated as stand still or stop. But the same word can also mean to be silent or to cease shining. If Joshua was commanding the sun to stop shining rather than stop moving, it could refer to an eclipse that darkened the sky and provided the extended twilight conditions Joshua needed to complete his victory. An annular eclipse occurs when the moon passes directly in front of the sun, but is too far away to cover it completely, creating the characteristic ring of fire appearance. This type of eclipse can create eerie lighting conditions that might have been interpreted as the sun standing still or behaving unusually. The ancient world didn't distinguish linguistically between different types of eclipses, and the Hebrew word used in Joshua has the same root as a Babylonian term used in astronomical texts to describe eclipses. The timing would have been perfect for Joshua's military needs. An eclipse during the heat of battle would have provided the psychological advantage of divine intervention while creating lighting conditions that favored continued fighting. The enemy forces would have been terrified by what appeared to be supernatural intervention, while Joshua's forces would have been encouraged by the sign of God's favor. However, critics of the eclipse theory point out a significant weakness. Eclipses typically last minutes, not hours. The biblical text clearly indicates an extended period of unusual daylight that lasted about a whole day. Even the longest total solar eclipses last only a few minutes, far short of the extended time period described in Joshua. This has led to other scientific theories attempting to explain the miracle while maintaining its supernatural character. Some suggest that God caused the Earth's rotation to slow down rather than stop completely, extending the day without causing the catastrophic effects of a complete halt. Others propose a supernatural mirage or refraction miracle where the Earth continued rotating normally while God provided additional light through miraculous means. There's also the theory that Joshua's prayer resulted in a localized miracle affecting only the region of the battle. Instead of stopping the entire Earth's rotation, God might have created a zone of extended daylight over the battlefield while the rest of the planet continued its normal cycle. This would explain how such a dramatic event could occur without causing global catastrophic effects or leaving evidence in other ancient cultures. But perhaps the most important aspect of this miracle isn't the mechanism behind it, but what it reveals about the relationship between human faith and divine power. Joshua's prayer wasn't a casual request or a desperate plea born of panic. It was a bold declaration of faith made in full view of both armies, a public statement that his God had the power to control the very heavens. Consider the courage it took to make such a prayer. Joshua was already in the middle of a successful battle. His forces were winning, the enemy was retreating, and victory seemed assured. He could have been content with a normal triumph. Instead, he asked for something impossible, something that had never been done before. He risked his reputation, his credibility, and his leadership by making a request that, if unfulfilled, would have made him look foolish before his entire army. But Joshua understood something profound about prayer and faith. He knew that God responds to bold requests made with genuine faith. He had seen miracle after miracle during the wilderness wanderings and the early stages of the conquest. He had learned that God's power was unlimited, and that the impossible was simply another opportunity for divine intervention. The response was immediate and unmistakable. The biblical text emphasizes that the Lord listened to the voice of a man, highlighting how extraordinary this was. Throughout Scripture, we see God responding to human prayers, but this was different. This was God altering the fundamental operations of creation in response to a single man's request. It was a demonstration of divine power so complete that it left no room for doubt about who was really in control of this battle. The military results were exactly what Joshua had hoped for. With unlimited daylight, his forces were able to pursue the enemy armies to complete destruction. The 5 kings were eventually found hiding in a cave at Makkedah, where they were captured and executed. Their cities fell one by one as Joshua's campaign swept through southern Canaan. What should have been years of siege warfare was accomplished in a matter of days. But the broader implications of this miracle extended far beyond military victory. Word of Joshua's long day spread throughout the ancient world, establishing Israel's reputation and their God's power in ways that ordinary conquest never could. Future enemies would hesitate before challenging a people whose deity could command the sun and moon. The psychological impact was immeasurable. For the Israelites themselves, this miracle became a cornerstone of their faith and national identity. It was proof that their God was not limited by natural law, that He was actively involved in their struggles, and that He would intervene supernaturally when necessary to fulfill His promises. Generations of Israelites would look back to Joshua's long day as evidence that nothing was impossible with God. The miracle also established a precedent for bold, faith-filled prayer that would echo throughout biblical history. When Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, when Hezekiah faced the Assyrian army, when Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, they all drew courage from the knowledge that their God was the same one who had stopped the sun at Joshua's request. This brings us to perhaps the most important question of all. What does Joshua's miracle mean for us today? We may not be fighting ancient Canaanite armies or leading military conquests, but we face our own impossible situations, our own overwhelming challenges, our own moments when we need divine intervention to succeed. The example of Joshua teaches us that God still responds to bold, faith-filled prayers. He still has the power to suspend natural laws when necessary for His purposes. He still fights for His people when they align themselves with His will and covenant promises. The same God who stopped the sun for Joshua is available to work miracles in our lives when we approach Him with genuine faith and desperate need. But Joshua's example also teaches us that bold prayers must be accompanied by bold action. Joshua didn't simply ask God to stop the sun and then retreat to his tent to wait. He continued fighting, continued pursuing the enemy, continued pressing his advantage. The miracle gave him the opportunity he needed, but he still had to seize that opportunity and act on it. This partnership between divine intervention and human action remains a crucial principle for believers today. We pray for miracles, but we also work diligently. We ask God for the impossible, but we also take responsibility for the possible. We trust in supernatural power, but we also use the natural abilities and resources God has given us. The day the sun stood still wasn't just about ancient warfare or biblical history. It was about the kind of God who responds to impossible requests, and the kind of faith that dares to ask for miracles. It was about a moment when heaven and earth intersected, when divine power met human need, when the natural order bowed to the supernatural will of the Almighty. As we face our own battles today, as we encounter our own impossible situations, as we wrestle with challenges that seem beyond our ability to overcome, we can draw courage from Joshua's example. We can approach God with the same boldness, the same faith, the same confidence that He has the power to intervene supernaturally on our behalf. The sun may not literally stand still in our sky, but the same God who performed that miracle is still working in our world today. He's still listening to the prayers of His people. He's still willing to suspend natural law when necessary for His purposes. And He's still looking for men and women who will dare to pray impossible prayers and then act with the faith to see them fulfilled. The question that remains isn't whether this miracle actually happened, but what it means for your life right now. Because here's the truth that cuts through every scientific debate, every scholarly argument, every attempt to explain away the supernatural. God is still the same yesterday, today, and forever. The same divine power that responded to Joshua's impossible prayer is available to you in your impossible circumstances. The same God who controlled the heavens for a desperate military commander will move heaven and earth for you when you approach Him with genuine faith and desperate need. But let me challenge you with something that might make you uncomfortable. Most of us pray small prayers because we worship a small God. We ask for manageable miracles because we've convinced ourselves that's all He can handle. We settle for natural solutions because we've forgotten that we serve a supernatural God who specializes in the impossible. Joshua didn't pray, "God, if it's not too much trouble, could you maybe give us a little extra time?" He commanded the sun to stand still. He made a request so audacious that it required the creator of the universe to reach into His creation and adjust the cosmic machinery. He prayed a prayer that was impossible to answer through natural means. When was the last time you prayed a prayer that required a miracle to answer? When was the last time you asked God for something so big, so impossible, so beyond your ability to accomplish that only divine intervention could make it happen? The tragedy isn't that God won't answer those prayers. The tragedy is that we've stopped praying them. We've become so sophisticated, so educated, so aware of natural law that we've forgotten the God who created those laws can suspend them anytime He chooses. Joshua's long day teaches us that bold prayers honor God, and God honors bold prayers. When you pray prayers that are impossible for you but possible for Him, you're acknowledging His unlimited power. You're declaring your dependence on His supernatural ability. You're positioning yourself for miracles that will glorify His name and demonstrate His reality to a watching world. But here's what you need to understand about praying impossible prayers. They come with impossible responsibilities. Joshua didn't just ask God to stop the sun and then sit back to watch. He continued fighting, continued pursuing, continued pressing forward with everything he had. The miracle gave him the opportunity, but he still had to seize it. God is looking for people who will partner with Him in the miraculous. He wants to work through individuals who will combine supernatural faith with natural action, who will trust Him for the impossible while working diligently in the possible, who will believe Him for miracles while taking responsibility for their part in seeing those miracles fulfilled. The sun standing still wasn't just about one battle in ancient history. It was about establishing a pattern that would echo through every generation. When God's people face impossible odds, when they align themselves with His purposes, when they pray with bold faith and act with courageous obedience, heaven invades earth and the impossible becomes inevitable. Your circumstances might feel overwhelming right now. The obstacles in your path might seem insurmountable. The challenges you're facing might appear to have no solution. But you serve the same God who stopped the sun for Joshua. You have access to the same supernatural power that suspended natural law for a desperate military commander. You can approach the same throne of grace with the same boldness and expect the same miraculous intervention. The question isn't whether God can work miracles in your life. The question is whether you have the faith to ask for them and the courage to act on them when they come. Will you dare to pray impossible prayers? Will you risk your reputation by publicly declaring your dependence on supernatural intervention? Will you step out in faith when God opens doors that shouldn't exist? This is your invitation to join the ranks of those who have seen the impossible become possible. This is your opportunity to discover what happens when human desperation meets divine power, when finite need collides with infinite ability, when earthly impossibility encounters heavenly authority. The day the sun stood still wasn't just Joshua's miracle. It was a demonstration of what becomes available to anyone who will approach God with impossible faith and act with unstoppable courage. It was proof that the God who controls the heavens is intimately involved in our earthly battles and willing to suspend natural law to secure supernatural victory for His people. So as you face your own giants, as you encounter your own impossible situations, as you stand at the crossroads between retreat and advance, remember Joshua's example. Look up at the same sky he commanded, approach the same God he trusted, and dare to ask for your own miracle. Because the God who made the sun stand still is still listening, still responding, still ready to demonstrate His power through anyone bold enough to believe Him for the impossible. Comment 777 if you're ready to start praying impossible prayers. And don't forget to subscribe for more biblical truths that will challenge your faith and change your life. Because this is just the beginning of what God wants to do through people who refuse to limit Him to natural solutions and dare to believe Him for supernatural intervention. The sun stood still for Joshua. What will God do for you?